Hi everyone, welcome back to Ways of the World, a brief global history with sources. We're going to conclude our study of empires in collision, Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, with the Japanese difference, the rise of a new East Asian power. So let's start with the Tokugawa background. So Tokugawa shoguns had ruled since about 1600. Their main task was preventing civil war among rival feudal lords, the daimyo. Japan enjoyed internal peace for about 250 years, 1600 to 1850. The daimyo were strictly regulated but retained considerable autonomy. Japan wasn't unified by a single law, currency, or central authority that reached to the local level. The hierarchical society was based on the samurai at the top, and then peasants, artisans, and merchants at the bottom. But there's considerable change in Japan in the Tokugawa period. The samurai evolved into a bureaucratic, almost administrative class. There's great economic growth, commercialization, and urban development. By 1750, Japan was perhaps the most urbanized country. There's a high literacy rate, about 40% of males and 15% of females. And the change made it impossible, though, for the shogunate to free society, and thus corruption was widespread. Widespread. All right, American intrusion and the Meiji Restoration. So the United States sent Commodore Perry in 1853 to demand better treatment for castaways, the right to refuel and buy provisions, and the opening of trade ports. Now, the shogun's spinelessness in agreeing to the demands of the quote-unquote foreign devils triggered a civil war. In 1868, a group of young samurai from the south took over, known as the Meiji Restoration. They claimed to be restoring the 15-year-old Emperor Meiji to power, and they aimed to save Japan from the foreigners by the transformation of Japanese society rather than by resistance. And the West wasn't as interested in Japan as it was in China, and they reduced pressure. All right, the black ships of the United States. So the initial occasion for serious Japanese reflection on the West occurred in 1853-1854 in the context of American Commodore Matthew Perry's efforts to, quote, open, end quote, Japan to regular commercial relationships with the United States. And his 9 coal-fired steamships, belching black smoke and carrying a new crew of some 1,800 men and more than 100 mounted cannons, became known in Japan as the quote-unquote black ships. Created around 1854, this image represents perhaps the best known of many such Japanese depictions of the American warships. So what features of this image reveal Japanese fears about contacts made by the United States? Well, the ship is depicted as assertive and scary. The Japanese knew little of the steam engine technology behind it, and the bellowing smoke is emphasized. Moreover, the 2 heads, one with a large point emerging from it, and the numerous guns, one being fired, were designed to elicit fear and even awe. Modernization, Japanese style. Now, the first task was creating national unity. They attacked power and privileges of the daimyo and the samurai. They dismantled the Confucian-based social order, and almost all Japanese became legally equal. And there's widespread interest in many aspects of the West, from science to hairstyles. And the official missions were official missions sent to the West. Hundreds of students studied abroad, and there's tons of translation of Western books into Japanese. And eventually they settled down to more selective borrowing from the West. Christianity made very little progress, as Shinto was raised to the level of a state cult. All right, let's continue with modernization Japanese style. They recognized that oppression of women impeded modernization. So there's universal education, but they were segregated by sex. Women were prohibited from public life, and the state-guided industrialization program established model factories, opened mines, built railroads, created postal, currency, and banking systems, and many state enterprises were then sold to private investors. And they accomplished modernization without acquiring foreign debt. Now, society paid a heavy price. Many peasant families were impoverished. Countryside suffered infanticide, they couldn't feed their children, sale of daughters, and even starvation. Early urban workers, especially females, received harsh treatment. But there were efforts to organize unions However, those were repressed. All right, Japan's modernization. So this wood print shows Commodore Perry's gift of a small-scale train to the Japanese in 1853. In Japan, as in Europe, railroads quickly became a popular symbol of the country's modernization. So to what extent are the signs of westernization shown in this image similar to those found in the image of the first Ottoman Constitution, which is from the previous section? Well, both images, people in Western dress extol the value of progress, especially epitomized here by the railroad. All right, Japan and the world. So by the early 20th century, Western powers readjusted treaties in Japan's favor, and Japan began empire building. There were wars against China, 1894 and 1895, and Russia, 1904 to 1905, and they gained colonial control of Taiwan and Korea and won a foothold in Manchuria. Japan was widely admired as a model for development or potentially an ally against imperialism, but Japan's colonial policies were at least as brutal as European ones. All right, Japanese women workers. Young women were prominent in Japan's emerging textile industries, just like in that of England. The women in this photograph from a silk factory around 1900 are spinning silk threads from raw cocoons. So to what extent are the elements of this early 20th century silk factory different from elements found in a modern factory? Well, unlike a modern factory, which is much more mechanized and electrified, this factory relies on manual labor and does not appear to be electrified. Japanese industrialization was described as quote-unquote labor-intensive because of the abundant workforce developed in Japan, evident here. All right, map 1903, the rise of Japan. So Japan modernized after the Meiji Restoration. It launched an empire-building program that provided a foundation for further expansion in the 1930s and during World War II. To what extent did Japan's geography create disadvantages for its imperialist policy compared to, say, China or Russia? Well, Japan, unlike China or Russia, was a small island nation with less resources due to its rugged terrain, while being in close proximity to these two much larger states made imperial expansion a more difficult task, reflected in the fact that Japan's territorial gains were largely on peripheral areas like Korea and the islands of Japan's in the northern and southern areas. All right, the modernization of China, 1911. So another sign of changing times in late 19th century China was the growing frequency with which more radical Chinese men began to cut or hide their queue, the long braided tail of their hair that descended from their largely shaved heads. That hairstyle had been forcibly imposed by Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty and had been periodically resisted since the 17th century. From the mid-1890s on, cutting the queue became a symbol of opposition to the Qing dynasty, of a favorable attitude toward modernization, and of a commitment to substantial political change in China. So this provides an illustration from 1911 of this radical political action. So how do you explain the responses to this event by the various figures visible in the image? Notice especially the man in the lower left with his hands upraised, and the man in Western dress in the lower right. Well, various reactions are evident in this image. The man in the center staring up at the cutting going on above them seems curious and intrigued. The man in the center walking away seems disgusted. The man at right, especially the one in Western dress, seems fascinated and pleased. So how does the public setting for this event shape your understanding of its significance? Keep in mind also that earlier in its history, the Qing dynasty had applied the death penalty for those cutting their queue. The fact that this event occurred in public demonstrates how open resistance to Manchu rule had become popular and people no longer feared retribution. All right, about the insurrectional movement in China in 1911. So in late 1911 and early 1912, more than 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history came to an inglorious end amid the confused maneuverings of various revolutionary groups, Qing dynasty loyalists, and constitutional reformers. The young boy emperor Puyi abdicated the imperial throne, and power passed to a prominent military leader, Yuan Shikai. Revolutionary ideas had penetrated the ranks of both officers and soldiers in China's modernizing quote-unquote new army, which had been in the making since 1901. Then this source, 1906, from a French newspaper of 1911, provides a visual account of the evolution of the Chinese military, with figures on the left representing older and now outdated Qing Dynasty units, and those on the right depicting the modernized forces of the new army that were so instrumental in the revolution of 1911. As it happened, those dramatic events were but the prelude for a far deeper and more violent revolutionary transformation of China in the half-century that followed. At the time, however, they marked a momentous turning point for an ancient civilization poised at the edge of a tumultuous upheaval. So what distinguishes these two groups of military men from one another? The Qing officers on the left are in traditional Chinese attire, while the quote-unquote new army are in Western, and thus, from the point of view of the French artist, modern attire, demonstrating the difference between tradition and progress. What does the image imply about their attitude towards one another? Well, the Qing officers on the left seem perturbed by the quote-unquote new army officers at right. Meanwhile, the modernized new army officers at right seem ambivalent to the existence of their predecessors. To what extent did this image reflect a European conception of reform and modernization? Well, the officers at right personify modernization. They look to the future in their plans while ignoring the past. This is a typical modern European conception of the faith in progress and modernity during this period. To what extent was its message consistent with those of the other authors in this section? When looking to the future through Westernization, the message depicted here is consistent with Kang Yui's assertions about the future of China, which is source 19.1. In eschewing the Qing past, it is also consistent with the cue-cutting image that we saw previously in source 19.4. Unlike all the other sources, however, it infers a hopeful future for China. And that concludes our study of the Japanese difference, the rise of a new Asian power, as well as chapter 19. I'll see you guys next time.